no one owned water. Water is not a commodity. It's not a property. Water is a kupuna. Water is an akua. And the Ali'i's responsibility, or our responsibility, is really to steward that for future generations.
Aloha mai kākou. Welcome to this conversation, Water and Civilization, a planetary experiment, brought to you by the Hawaii Book and Music Festival and the Better Tomorrow Speaker Series, which is a joint venture of the University of Hawaii at Manoa, Hawaii Community Foundation, and Kamehameha Schools. I'm Kapua Sproat, and I'm moderating today's conversation. Ola ika wai, water is life. As people who live on tiny islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, here in Hawaii, we are keenly aware that fresh water is a vital source of life across our archipelago. Since time immemorial, Kanaka Maoli, Hawaii's indigenous people, have revered fresh water as a kinolau of Akua Kane, a physical embodiment of one of our major gods of the Native Hawaiian pantheon. It's a life force that sustains natural resources and spiritual mana, or power. It feeds our indigenous culture, and it defines who we are as a people. The story of freshwater in Hawaii is unfortunately similar to others across island Earth. Freshwater was revered in Native Hawaiian society and carefully managed as a public trust for present and future generations. It was a foundation for natural systems, indigenous law and communities, and entire islands. It was also coveted by foreigners who moved to our shores, especially to subsidize the rise of plantation agriculture, including sugar and pineapple. The commodification of freshwater rewrote the social contract and transformed life in Hawaii as we know it. We have with us here today 3 individuals who have made water their life's work. We will start with the discussion of world history through water with Dr. Giulio Boccaletti and his phenomenal book, Water, a Biography. Then we'll move on to Dr. Kamanamaikalani, a Native Hawaiian professor and scholar, to help us deconstruct what all of that means for us here in Hawaii. And third, we'll talk story with Ernie from the City and County of Honolulu's Board of Water Supply to dig into the Red Hill fiasco, Hawaii's most pressing water crisis. Our first guest, with whom I'll be speaking for about 20 minutes, is Giulio Boccaletti. Giulio has followed a winding river to this book. Trained as a physicist and climate scientist, he has earned his doctorate at Princeton, where he was a NASA Earth System Science Fellow. He has been a research scientist at MIT, a partner of McKinsey & Company, and a chief strategy officer of the Nature Conservancy. He is currently a research fellow at Oxford and an acclaimed musician. Aloha and welcome, Giulio.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start by talking a bit about your varied career for a moment and your journey to this book. You've worked in academia, the private sector, and with large NGOs. How did this experience prepare you to be a historian?
Good question. Well, I mean, it'd be the reader's judgment as to whether it did prepare me for it. I suppose that, I started life as a scientist, as a climate scientist in front, as an oceanographer and a climate scientist. And my purpose, my hope was to have an impact in the world. And so as often happens to some academics, you end up deciding that you need to leave the ivory tower and see whether you can engage the world. And I went into the private sector and also in civil society organizations, as you said. And in all those experiences, I tried to engage the public, decision makers, CEOs, ministers, with the science and the engineering, the facts about water. And over time, I came to realize that water, a bit like you said in your introduction, really speaks to the identity of people, to their most profound relationship with their landscape, with their home. And so I realized that any conversation about water would start with science and would end with story and maybe history, right? And so when I came to wanting to write this book, I wanted to engage a broader public on what is happening to our water environment today, what is happening to our relationship with water. And I strongly believe that you can't understand that without engaging in story. And the one language that brings all the stories together is that of history. And so that's why I ended up writing a book about history. It's not a book about history in a historiographic sense, but it's a book of stories of history, right, with a purpose of revealing our relationship with water.
Absolutely, and a fascinating story it is. I mean, I'm a long fan of water and water history, and I absolutely loved your book. And so I
Thank
want
you.
to dig in a little bit to your story and your history. You're also an acclaimed musician, so please share a little bit about that with us.
That's right. That may well be my most lasting contribution to the planet. I am a very proficient ocarina player, and there is an interesting connection with water here because I come from the plains of the Po River. And the Po River is, is the biggest river in Italy. You should think of it as the Mississippi of Italy, except that it's much, much smaller. And in that Po Valley, there's a lot of clay, particularly from where I come from. The soils are very rich in clay. And so, the architecture, for example, is all made of red brick, and, the roofs are all red with red tiles. And of course, when the poorest in society wanted to construct an instrument to play their music, the easiest thing to do was to build and make clay instruments. And so that's what they did. And the ocarina is a flute made of clay. It happens to be a chromatic instrument, so you can play anything on it. I play jazz, classical music, anything. But it's a very simple and poor instrument made out of fire and water and land and clay. And so it really speaks to my interests in the earth and in water.
Perfectly. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Your book is really sweeping. It starts with star formation and the production of oxygen, which can then combine with hydrogen to make water. And it goes all the way up to the present and then looks to the future. So if we conceive of chapters of world history through water management, how do they break down in your view?
Well, there's a few sort of milestones in that long history, right? I mean, we humans, as the dominant hominids on the planet, have been around for maybe 300,000 years. That's, a final blip compared to when water appeared on the planet, which is, over 3.5 billion years ago. But over the last 300,000 years, we've been around and we've progressively become the dominant species, even causing extinctions during the Pleistocene and the likes. But there's a real turning point around 10,000 years ago when most of us, not all of us, but many of us, become sedentary. And suddenly we stand still in a world of moving water. And the world was indeed moving with water because this was a time when we were coming out of the last glacial maximum. And in fact, it was probably the peak moment of change, the peak moment during which the deglaciation was taking place. That's when we decided to stand still. And so we were surrounded by water. And that's really the first and big milestone, because water, you were talking about water as embodying divinity. Well, water is an incredibly powerful agent on the landscape. It's the agent of the climate system, and it operates at scales that far transcend individual agency. And so by the nature of its phenomena on the planet, it forces us to exercise collective action. And so that point of time, 10,000 years ago, is when we suddenly found ourselves having to work together to confront this enormous power on the territory. And so that's maybe the start of this political relationship. Exercising power collectively is ultimately about power. And so that's when the journey that I focus on really starts. And then, the book is quite sweeping, as you said, and so I won't go through all the stages of it, but suffice it to say that many of the institutions, even those that are most abstract and that surround us today, from the political institutions of democracies and republics to the legal systems, to even, profound ideas like monotheism, have in their DNA the nature of our relationship with the landscape, and in particular, the nature of our relationship with water. And so the book tells that long story, which for 9,900 years was the dominant story of people on the landscape, until, and that's the final kind of maybe important segment in that story, we decide to replumb the planet. In the 20th century, the promise of 20th century modernism was full emancipation from the variability of nature. That's why many people don't wade a river going to work or open a tap or coming out of their wall and water suddenly comes out. And that final milestone that has occupied the last 150 years has essentially separated us from water and from the nature of water, creating an illusion of control that is now breaking. The climate system is on the move again. We've caused that. And the way in which climate expresses itself is through water. And so that final chapter that tells the story of how we forgot about water is also the starting point for reconnecting with this force.
Absolutely. And, you know, one of the things that really struck me was how you argue that the history of water and humanity is more about politics than about technology. And so I was wondering if you could share a little bit more insight into what you mean about that.
Sure. Well, I think that because our relationship with water is in fact about exercising our collective action on the environment. By this, I mean, we have to work together. Societies for over 9,000 years have had to work together to construct levees and capture water when it comes down, to deliver it when it's not available, and protecting communities from destructive floods or from catastrophic storms, something that we're still doing today. You know, think of Hurricane Ian that went just through Florida a few weeks ago, and the typhoons that hit the Pacific Ocean, of course, right? So these are all water phenomena that we have to confront. And the answer, of course, there's a technology involved in building a levee or building a dam, and there's technology in providing clean water to people. But the heart of it is about working together to transform the landscape, construct an artificial ecosystem in order to support the life at the pace that we want, in our case, the pace of industrial society and commercial society. And so this is about exercising power. And so if you look at the 10,000 years of history that I've been reviewing in my story, most of the big milestones, most of the big transformations are really not about any particular invention, but they're about the rules of the game, the rules that we give ourselves to live together, and in particular, about the distribution of power. If, you know, one example amongst many is the rise of democracy in Athens, which we all learn about in sort of Western high schools. That moment in time is about a transformation of the political system of a society, right? So it's about the emancipation of farmers in 5th and 4th century Athens. But it's an emancipation that happens because those farmers were economically powerful, and they were economically powerful by virtue of the way in which they managed rainfall. And so in the book, I reveal it's not that water causes any of these institutions, but we engage in a dialectic relationship with it, and in doing so, we transform our political institutions. So in that sense, the story of water is a political story before it ever is a technological story.
Absolutely. And one of the things you just spoke of is how societies have really moved to influence the rules of the game. And something that I've focused on is how our relationship with water, especially here in Hawaii, has shaped the law. And I'd love your thoughts on that from, you know, more of a global perspective.
Well, I mean, the law and the modern legal systems and its origins actually are an important thread through the story that I tell. Of course, I'm Italian, so you'll detect some degree of bias in the book, in that I spend a lot of time talking about Rome and the tradition of Italy. But that's partly also because it has a disproportionate impact on the modern mainstream legal system. That's not to say that there aren't other legal systems, traditional legal systems, that are worth talking about. But in terms of the architecture of our institutions, and particularly of our legal institutions, the roots of that are in Rome. And Roman law was designed to essentially enact the republic. The Romans didn't talk about it as a republic, but it was about this balance between individual liberty and emancipation, the political emancipation and civic emancipation of individuals, in their case, you know, males and heads of families, of course, and the collective responsibility to the management of resources. So the legal system in Rome is born out of that, and that's probably the most important legacy of that time. Now, when that legacy, that's, you know, essentially captured by the Justinian Code, by the the sort of 5th century codification of the 1,000 years of legal history, when that gets sort of fished out of the darkness of history in the Middle Ages, in the 12th century, incidentally, in my hometown of Bologna, the first, the first modern university in the Western world, when it's fished out from the depths of history, it provides Europe first, and then through the colonial project, the rest of the world, with a system of rules of unprecedented lucidity and coherence. And so they end up entering into the Magna Carta and into all the sort of legal systems and providing the underlying architecture for our living together. Now, most of the jurisprudence that people initially developed with this legal system was on water, because particularly in the north of Italy, this was a fragmented territory of small municipalities that fought for the rights to use the big rivers around them with each other, and found in the Roman law, in the Roman code, a system to decide and attribute rights, right? And so that's kind of where the first couple of hundred years of jurisprudence developed. That's what's in the Magna Carta, for example. Article 33 of the Magna Carta is about the management of the Thames by the City of London. And that, of course, becomes ingrained in all of our legal institutions. The last thing I'll say on this is that, even our international relations, the legal systems that are actually now in crisis, but that are under the sort of a system of international relations and that are based on mutual recognition of sovereignty, the treaties of Westphalia and Münster, well, those treaties are about mutual recognition of sovereign entities, in that case, Spain and the Republic of the Netherlands, across a river, right? The Scheldt, or across a river, the Rhine. And so, in truth, in the legal system, I mean, it's endlessly fascinating. If I were a lawyer and studying law today, I would study water law, because I think it's endlessly fascinating and probably the kind of the building block of how we will deal with climate going forward.
Well, I couldn't, as an attorney, and a water attorney in particular, I couldn't agree with you more. And actually, I find all of this fascinating, and I'll have to, think of other folks and not just stick to the legal topics, because I think there's so many similarities with how things have evolved in Hawaii. And one thing that I would love to talk more with you about is kind of how to incorporate and include Indigenous and island perspectives in all of this, because I think we're a microcosm, right, of everything else on a smaller scale. And so it's just concentrated. And I think we see very similar themes with respect to the law.
Yeah,
so,
no, for sure.
Yeah. And your book is just hot off the presses. And since then, we've seen epic water-related disasters since publication. And you mentioned some of them, right? The devastating floods in Pakistan and now Nigeria. So how does your perspective on world history help us to understand these events and perhaps more importantly, where we're going from here?
Well, I think that the reason I wrote the history, I'm a scientist by training, I'm a climate scientist. And so I start my journey with concern for where the climate system is headed, and with the knowledge that wherever it's headed, it will express itself through water. And so I know that water events are ahead of us. But I also wrote this as a history because I had a great concern as a scientist and as someone who's a practitioner who's worked on these issues for a long time, which is that we tend to have these discussions about water or about sustainability more broadly as conversations that say, follow the science, listen to the scientists. And of course, you should listen to the experts and scientists in terms of the diagnoses of the problems that we face. But we cannot relinquish our responsibility as citizens of communities in solving those issues. And so what the history that I described reveals is that over time, success in dealing with water problems is not about some engineer coming up with a new answer, is not about a scientist developing a new technology, or even improving the ability to predict a phenomenon. Mm-hmm. They're about the development of legitimate political institutions. And that's where your example of the small island and indigenous culture comes in, because that legitimacy starts with the enfranchisement and the empowerment of the citizenship, right, of those people who make up the community of a place. And so what I see happening going forward is that we risk being distracted by the scientific description of the problems we face. Take Pakistan, an example. Pakistan had this tremendous monsoon this year, which caused enormous amounts of misery. 30 million people were affected. Close to 1,600 people died in the process. In Sindh, there's a catastrophe. And of course, most of the media coverage was about how this was a monsoon on steroids, as the UN Secretary General described it, right? A symptom of the changing climate. And that, of course, is true. There's a fact of the matter about the intensity of this phenomenon and how it was powered by changing circumstances. But we shouldn't forget that a similar monsoon happened 12 years ago. In 2010, Pakistan went through a very similar problem, and 2,000 people died, 20 million people were affected. At the time, it was described as the most disastrous flood event in history, far surpassing the Indian tsunami. And the key question here is why in 12 years from that phenomena, nothing was done to put into safety and ensure the safety of the Pakistani population, right? 12 years is a long time to intervene. And of course, that's not the fault of the climate system. That's a failure of politics. Now, the question is what happened to the international community and to the Pakistani government such that they were unable to even marginally improve the security of that population. And so that's why this history is so important, because over and over again, we see that when people are protected, it's because they are part of a respublica, they're part of a republic. This is a Republican book, not in a narrow American political sense, but in a sense of, advocating for active citizenship in a Commonwealth project.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And that was one of the things that I took away is how we all need to be, active participants in our water future, right? We need to look to our history to understand how we move forward. So mahalo, Giulio, for your book and for all of the amazing stories that it shares. I hope we'll have another opportunity to talk more about what it means for communities across the globe, including Hawaii. And I encourage everyone to read this book. Mahalo.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now I'd really like to zoom in and transition from thinking about water on a global scale to what it all means for us here in Hawaii, our tiny islands in the middle of the vast Pacific Ocean. We are so fortunate this morning to have one of Hawaii's preeminent scholars and thought leaders join us for this conversation. Kamanamaikalani Beamer is a professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, who is cross-programmed between the law school and Hawaii Nui Akea School of Hawaiian Knowledge. He is also the Dana Naone Hall Chair in Hawaiian Studies. Now, there is so much that I could say about Professor Beamer. He is a father and an artist and a songwriter, an acclaimed scholar and an inspired teacher. His scholarship has really reframed the way that people today understand important events in Hawaii's history, including the Waiāhole, which introduced the hybridized system of land ownership in Hawaii today. In 2021, he completed 2 terms on Hawaii's Water Commission, where he put his formal and his cultural education to work and was able to do things such as recognizing traditional Native Hawaiian land divisions, or kalana, as a traditional customary Native Hawaiian practice, as well as a host of other things. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Beamer.
Vilina mai, ke aloha I ka aina ia kākou, pakahia pau. It's a real honor and a privilege. Thank you, Professor Sproat. I want to go on the record. Kapua is the prominent scholar on water in Hawaii and has done so much to support more than anyone that I can think of, to support communities and advocacy around traditional customary rights and the public trust. So it's a real honor. And Giulio, mahalo for that fantastic talk. I'm super excited by your work and the book and thinking, about water's influence on democracy, and can't agree enough that, I think many of the problems we face aren't scientific and are political. So mahalo for that.
Yeah, that is a perfect introduction, because I think in so many ways, much of the work that you have done has been really grappling with the political nature of water. And so, Kamana, you descend from a long line of scholars, cultural experts, manawahine, and warriors. What brought you to water, and what inspires you to do this work?
Oh, wow. Mahalo. You bring up, it makes me think of my tutu and my family. And yeah, I think it's a real simple thing. I think for all of us, most of us in Hawaii, when we grow up, our fondest memories, our earliest memories are with my tutu taking me to the beach, getting in the kai, maybe jumping in streams. I had a crazy uncle that would take me all in the back country, find all the waterfalls, and go look for whatever had in the streams and go play. And so streams and Wai have always been a playground. I feel like water in Hawaii and probably around the world is something that brings out the best in people. And so I'm just inspired, and I want our keiki to have, those same forms of liberty to experience the kahawai flowing and the hihivai. When you first find the hihivai, that's so amazing. It's like, wow, where is it? You pull it out. It's not one opihi. Oh, look at these, the features on it. All of these memories are so important to me, Kapua.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for sharing that, Kamana. I think, for many people growing up like Kamana, I grew up collecting and eating hihivai. These are these small freshwater mollusks that grow on the or that live on the underside of rocks, often in our kahawai or our streams. And they're such an important part of they're not the charismatic megafauna people think of with our indigenous kind of Hawaiian animals, but they are such an important part of our web of life, not just naturally, but culturally as well. And the history of water in Hawaii is so closely tied to narratives of colonization and power and profit, not unlike what Giulio wrote about in his book. And, this is a familiar refrain with too many indigenous people I've found. But our story of water in Hawaii before the arrival of foreigners is also one of life and abundance in many forms, some of which you mentioned, like the hihivai. So in some places around the world, right, the definition of water is like tasteless, odorless substance. Here, it's life, wealth. And for me, it's no coincidence that our word in Olelo Hawaii, our mother tongue, our word for fresh water is vai. Wealth is vai, and the law is kanavai, all of which are rooted in fresh water. So can you please share with our audience your understanding of the importance of fresh water for Native Hawaiians and really for all Kanaka and Hawaii? And you started on that with your childhood story, but like what else do we need to know?
No, I think there's fantastic question and so important. And, I want to sort of frame it in the sense that islands, our islands are an earth. The problems that we face in island ecosystems, terrestrial and marine, social, are all sort of contained examples of the problems that we experience around the planet. And so when we study our ancestral systems around water, I think there's principles that can help other places in the world. We're not just studying solutions for Hawaii when we're solving problems here. They're scalable. In many ways, like Giulio is talking about some of the challenges in his own home place and town that are, transmittable to other places in the world. So our kupuna, being on the most, if we think of our islands as the most isolated, at least terrestrially on the planet, when we came here, we understood water is life, ola ikawai. It is the most precious resource, the reason why we could have life, any form of industry, food, celebration is all connected to our access to wai. And so our kupuna's understanding of that word, just like you said, Kapua, what a great contrast. Tasteless, odorless substance, water. Wai, ola ikawai, water is life. Wai, wealth. Water means wealth. What a different perspective that immediately calls out our relationship to this most precious resource. And so our kupuna really, actually, in ways like Giulio had talked about, I was fascinated, structured our legal system, and our economy around water. And in fact, like, the word kanawai comes from wai, translated to law, and sort of our earliest relationships and in terms of access and prohibitions and protections were around water. In fact, our entire economy was meant to be like water. The system and the functioning, the fact that our people had access to everything in their ahupua'a, that represents that distribution, that water that comes down, rains down, flows through streams, distributes, right, and comes down to the muliwai, And that function was really a part of our ancestral economy. I can get into a lot more detail. The word kalai aina, which was really this process by ali'i, generationally, talking about redistributing resources amongst, this class of people. And it had to happen. That word kalai aina, what's the thing that carves out the aina? I didn't realize this until recently. And I always thought, wow, what a weird word, kalai aina. Like we weren't carving canoes. It's water. The thing that carves out the aina is water. And so our ancestral system was trying to, in ways, emulate, honor, kane kawai ola. And we understood ancestrally that, we deified water because it provided life. And so there's so many precious relationships on a very small, intimate scale with your ohana to these larger scale systems in terms of how we're supposed to manage our resources that are all embedded in our kupuna's conception of water.
Perfectly said, as usual. I think, one of the really unique things about Hawaii is our constitutional public trust doctrine, which holds our resources and fresh water in particular in trust for present and future generations. And for me, it's what's really special is that here in Hawaii, that's grounded in Native Hawaiian values. So things such as aloha aina, which you're a recognized expert in. Can you provide a brief overview for us of Hawaii's public trust doctrine, as well as our system of water resource management?
Sure. What's amazing here is, ancestrally, like I said, no one owned water. Water is not a commodity. It's not a property. Water is a kupuna. Water is an akua. And the ali'i's responsibility, or our responsibility, is really to steward that for future generations. And so that's a fundamental principle of the public trust, right? Is that water isn't owned, and it should be managed for the benefit of future generations and the environment today. And that perspective is not, Anglo, is not European. Here in Hawaii, that was really our relationship with water ancestrally. And so when our ali'i began to codify their legal systems and structures in the 1840s, with the very first Kumu Kanawai of 1840, the Declaration of Rights of 1839, even in the Mahele itself, water was never a commodity, and it always maintained this public trust-like relationship that comes from our ancestral understandings that we don't own water, we don't create water. It's a gift for all of us, and we have to constantly understand that. I appreciated Giulio's perspectives around, technology isn't the thing that's going to solve our issues with water. It is about politics and our relationships and our understanding that it's a gift and we don't control it. It will flood, like Pakistan and Ha'ena, and we have to be mindful of our relationship to water. And so that's some of the ways that, the public trust, was developed here in our islands. And then, after the overthrow, went through this period where they literally did commodify water, built these large infrastructures, moved water out of streams, starved families of their access to grow haloa. This is a real thing, 125 years of injustice. And then we come up with, a Hawaiian gets on the Hawaii State Supreme Court. He's, the name of our law school, C.J. Richardson. And he begins to, re-implement ancestral perspectives around water that was codified in the Hawaiian Kingdom, and that leading up to, creation of the Commission on Water Resource Management, accepting the public trust in the Hawaii State Constitution, are all these pivotal points to sort of swing the pendulum back.
And that brings us to, where we are today. And what a great encapsulation of our history, and I think of the public trust in our system of laws, but really how that's grounded in Native Hawaiian values and how important that is. And I think around the world, especially given our new climate reality, people are recognizing that we need to look to this biocultural knowledge of Indigenous people if we want to survive this next this next phase of our history. And so you mentioned the Water Commission, and you've served 2 terms on Hawaii's Water Commission, the entity charged with managing our ground and our surface water resources. So as someone who has been monitoring these issues for some time now, One of the things that I noticed was that while you're on the commission, it began to embrace Native Hawaiian values and principles, right? Acknowledging kalana, looking at traditional and customary practices, and setting interim in-stream flow standards, which are these vital standards that establish the minimum amount of water that have to stay in our stream. So please share a little bit about your time on the commission and perhaps the work that you're most proud of.
Challenging and difficult work. I got on the commission. I was, the youngest commissioner in my early 30s, and really green to the complexities of politics in Hawaii. So I had to, what's the metaphor? They call it cut your teeth there on the commission. I think the thing is, there was a bunch of people before me, the people that created the Hawaii Con in 1978, people like yourself, Kapua, that has been fighting alongside communities for 20 plus years to get water back into the streams, to get traditional and customary rights. It's recognized in the Constitution, but to get it in practice on the commission was another step. And so, I came in studying the mahele and thinking about why, and I didn't realize how impactful that could be, in creating policy on the commission. And so I'm very proud of that work. It was very hard. There were times when I thought, am I going to fail? Is this going to work? There was a lot of anxiety there. As a Kanaka, getting into a system and a structure that usually hasn't served us well is not an easy space to operate in. But because of the public trust, because of the Hawaii State Constitution, because of the commissioners that I was able to work alongside with to get, collective understanding that, hey, if we do this, it's actually going to benefit everyone. It is going to be more in line with what the commission should decide. And we maybe won't have as many appeals in the Hawaii State Supreme Court. And so, that's some of the work that was involved with. I think I'm most proud of, in the 8 years that I was on the commission, seeing our people rise. It's gonna make me emotional, but by the time I left the commission, we had testimonies, makulala Hawaii. I saw keiki in communities coming and testifying, remotely to talk about their place and their significance of water. And that was such a marked difference from when I first entered the commission. And I can see Aloha Aina is rising. And so that's something that I'm deeply proud of, just to be a part of that movement and advocacy for justice, for people and our Aina in our islands.
I think that is a really important story to elevate, right? The way our people, the rise of Aloha Aina, and people coming to share their stories, and how you have been part of elevating people's stories and making it possible for folks to be heard. And so mahalo for that. We've talked a bit about Giulio's book, but you're also coming out with a book on water. And so kind of thinking about connecting Hawaii to the larger world for a moment, I was really struck by how Giulio's book positions Sun Yat-sen as a progenitor of hydraulic modernism, right? This impulse to control water and its flow to the degree that one ever can, which culminated, one Chinese revolution later in the gargantuan Three Gorges Dam project, which was hugely controversial for so many ways. And Sun Yat-sen conceived of some of his ideas while he was here in Hawaii. But what I found fascinating was that he looked only towards the United States and that history kind of water use. What might have been different if he had paid attention to our indigenous water management history as well? So what does Hawaii have to teach the world more generally?
Yeah, I think, this is a really fascinating idea and topic. And Sun Yat-sen, I think the fact that he was educated, it was, still in the Hawaiian Kingdom in many ways. So his access to education is partly a result of, the progressive politics of Hawaii at the time, and his access to these amazing systems of education that happen. I do, wow, if we could, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, if we could jump back and tell him, hey, come check out the Awai, come learn about, these systems that our people are managing. That would have been fantastic. And I I would love to, imagine his creativity and what he would bring to that, to solve these critical problems around water in the world. So that's wow, that's amazing, Kapua. You know, I think that's really all I can and sort of project and understand. I mean, oftentimes we overlook the brilliance of our ancestral knowledge and of our communities, to be honest, that still understand many of these principles in terms of sharing Wai. I spent about 15 years trying to be a mahi'ai in Waipio and restoring lo'i there. And, what I understood was people understand how to run the away and they understand how to share. And when there's problems and conflicts, it can be really heated, but everybody understands, that ancestral thing that nobody owns the water. It is a gift, and I think had Sun Yat-sen really gotten deeper into that perspective, maybe some of the problems that we face today wouldn't be as harsh.
Mahalo for those gems of wisdom. And I wish more people would look back in inspiring and thinking about how we can best move forward. So mahalo for joining us today, Kamana, and for your scholarship, your leadership, and your service. You inspire me and so many others.
No, mahalo nui. And there is a book, Waiāhole, Water and the Future of Hawaii. In fact, we're in sort of final revisions now with UH Press. As you know, Kapua is a co-author. Ernie, Lau, and Board of Water have an article on Red Hill. We have fantastic contributors, Tom Giambaluca, Kael Dwart, so many. So yeah, it'll be coming out soon, and I hope it'll be a collective resource, to get our communities to understand why. So mahalo nui. Thank you, Kapua, for the time. Aloha, Giulio. We hope.
Ahuiho. Our final guest is on the front lines of Hawaii water issues, as well as Kamana and so many others. Although he has been doing this work for decades, with the emergence of Red Hill as perhaps the most pressing water crisis that Hawaii has seen in our lifetimes, now many more people are looking to him for advice. Ernie Lau is the chief engineer and manager of the City and County of Honolulu's Board of Water Supply. He is one of the principal people ensuring that about 1 million people on Oahu get between 145 to 150 million gallons of drinking water every single day, while also trying to ensure that that water is clean and safe. So mahalo for joining us, Ernie.
Oh, aloha, Kapua, and aloha, everybody.
Ernie, I have had the great privilege of knowing you for more than 2 decades now, from when you headed up the Department of Water Supply on the important island of Kauai, then as the Deputy Director of Hawaii's Water Commission, and most recently as the Chief Engineer of the City and County of Honolulu's BWS. And in the interest of full disclosure, I do want to share that in my spare time, I volunteer as the Vice Chair of BWS. So to me, Ernie, you're a true servant leader who's really been at the forefront of water issues for us here in Hawaii. So what brought you to both water issues and public service?
Well, on the water side, it started when I was just a young child growing up in Waipahu, and playing in the rivers and streams, working in my uncle's lo'i, and fishing along the shores of Pearl Harbor, Pu'uloa. And water's always been very important. And then one day, I think I was in elementary school, I took a field trip with my class to the Board of Water Supply. They actually used to come here to the Veritania offices. And that pipe that's sticking up in the front of a yard here at Veritania, that actually is connected to the wells, the artesian wells. So they turned off the electric pumps and they opened up the valve, and artesian water gushed out of that pipe. And that image still stands in my mind almost 50 years later. And I have this faded photo of that picture, that image in my office here. That's my first exposure to water. And I've always been a person that wants to help people. And I just going to school at the University of Hawaii and in the College of Engineering, and deciding on what kind of career I wanted to get into. And government service, public service was the most attractive, not working for the private sector and trying to make lots of money, but really trying to help people.
And help people you have. About a year ago now, I got my first bumper sticker that says, "In Ernie we trust." And with the increasing attention on Red Hill, you have emerged, Ernie, as a local hero. I know you hate it, but it's true. And, you know, someone that everyone from nice local kids from Pro City or Waipahu to Congress folks in DC really rely on. And for years now, almost a decade, you have been speaking truth to power. I mean, you called out the Red Hill issue when almost no one cared. And you have been our canary in the coal mine. You predicted that large-scale contamination would occur if more wasn't done, and nothing was done. So, you know, now many are grateful, but previously I'd have to say some sort of viewed you as perhaps a pest, and that's being polite. And so where do you find the courage to continue? I think especially with so much politicking and pressure. And what advice would you give to our local kids, or maybe even to potential whistleblowers or decision makers who are hesitant to speak truth to power and be as courageous as you have been?
You know, I think it starts in my relationship to Kapua, that, you know, the vai that we have in our islands, the precious vai, is really a gift from Kapua. We are very fortunate on these islands to have this type of resource, especially here in Oahu. And I remember being in a legislative hearing back in 2014, and having to decide in front of the 6 legislative committees what I would say about this Red Hill situation. And I thought, you know, I have to tell the truth. I have to tell the truth that this was a disaster waiting to happen. And I would say, and I'm just a regular person. There's nothing special about Ernie Lau. I'm just like everybody else in the community. But if you can just look into your heart and speak from your heart and have the courage to say what you think is right, and you can accomplish amazing things. I never dreamed I would be in this situation almost 9 years later, to be at the point of the spear on this issue. But, you know, that's just people serving communities, helping communities, and being able to speak out and having the courage to do that.
Well, mahalo for really working to Awamo to shoulder that responsibility, Ernie, and for being that tip of the spear. Now, I can't imagine that there's someone watching that hasn't heard of the water contamination at Red Hill, but just in case that person is out there, can you please get us up to speed with what happened at Red Hill and where we are now?
So the story begins back in 1940, before Pearl Harbor was attacked. The U.S. Navy was preparing, I think, for war in those days, and they decided to build a huge underground fuel storage facility there at the ridge of Red Hill or Kapua. And they built these 20 tanks. Each tank is 250 feet tall, 100 feet across, and can hold 12.5 million gallons of fuel. And these tanks are about 3 miles inland, and they're connected by 3 large pipelines that go all the way down to Pearl Harbor. And the only thing holding the fuel in these tanks is a 1/4-inch steel plate that was welded together that's rusting from the outside in. So at its maximum, this facility could store over 250 million gallons of fuel. And the unfortunate thing about it, the bottoms of these tanks are only 100 feet above our precious vai, our precious drinking water aquifer that we rely upon in that area, that each year over 1 billion gallons of fresh water flows through this area. And these tanks have been leaking many times over its history. So that's what's happened. And last year we saw the really unfortunate situation where the fuel leaks from these tanks, actually from a pipeline connected to these tanks, got into their drinking water source, Red Hill Shaft, for the U.S. Navy, and contaminated practically the entire water system for Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam, serving about 93,000 people. The unimaginable, unfortunately, happened. Now, I've always thought, having been working on this nearly 9 years now, that nobody was really listening, that it would take something terrible to happen, unfortunately, before people woke up and did something about it. And I am so sad that it has taken that to wake people up. The positive I see, though, is that the awareness of this precious gift of Vai to our community, these resources, and how fragile these resources are, that has become common knowledge across the community. And the community coming together has really made the difference at Red Hill. Not Ernie Lau by myself, but the whole community working together. So our decision makers at all levels of government have now aligned, and we need to continue to move forward to remove the fuel from these tanks and clean up our contaminated aquifer.
Ernie, you raise a really important point about the contamination, and something that I've been really grappling with is that, is it true that there has never been the successful cleanup of contamination like this on this scale on an aquifer-wide basis? And if so, what does that mean for us who live on Oahu or who would like to live on Oahu in the future?
Yeah, you know, I haven't heard of an effective cleanup of this scale. I know that in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, they had a fuel leak from a Air Force fueling facility that leaked maybe 20 million gallons of fuel into their aquifer. And here they are over 20 years later, still trying to deal with the contamination. And they haven't been unable, the military's been unable to clean it up. So I think it will be very challenging. I don't know if it's even going to be possible. The opportunity we still have is there's still 100 million gallons of fuel there. We can use prevention as a strategy right now to eliminate, by removing that fuel from being over the aquifer, to remove that risk of further damage to our precious Vai, our precious underground aquifer. So I think that's something that's clearly should be done as quickly as possible with no delay.
Absolutely. I hear you on that one. And I've also heard from a wide range of sources. I mean, community members, politicians, developers, more. Everyone seems to be incredibly frustrated with the Navy. You know, here they've ignored persistent warnings. They've contaminated Oahu's principal source of drinking water, perhaps irrevocably. And now the people of Oahu are being asked to bail them out on multiple levels. So BWS ratepayers are having to drill wells to check on the scope of the contamination and how and where the plume is moving. We're paying for expensive testing. Folks have to conserve water because some of BWS's sources are offline because they're at risk of contamination and they may never be able to be used again. And now the military is asking BWS for water for 93,000 people. And so what would you say to our community in response to these frustrations and criticisms?
I would say that let us not relent on putting pressure on the Navy to take responsibility for this and to even repay the people of Oahu for the cost of all these actions that now become necessary only because of this Red Hill fuel contamination. And like you said, Kapua, they have known about this situation for over a decade, maybe a couple of decades or longer, that this facility was not in good shape and had risks. They did studies about the dangers of this facility and the need to install a treatment system to protect their Red Hill shaft, their drinking water source, which is only about a quarter mile away from the fuel tanks. But they never actually took action. They did the studies, but they never implemented. So I would say, you know, keep the pressure on as a community. Let us not relent. Let us work together to, although we need to still do things like water conservation, we are going to look for new wells and have to pursue new water sources to replace that capacity. should we not be able to turn those 3 wells that are shut down ever on again? Our community needs affordable housing. It needs water to thrive. Our economy needs water. So for the Board of Water Supply, we're going to continue to pursue options, even though the Navy's created this problem. The one thing I've told the military too, their average day water demand is 18 to 20 million gallons a day for the entire Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam. Board of Water Supply is already short with the 3 wells shut down, between 13 to 17 million gallons a day of well capacity. So I'm letting them know, don't expect the Board of Water Supply, the community, to be able to bail them out should their remaining water source go down. We can't give them that kind of water. And I'll try to help to the degree possible, but not at the expense of our community. The military needs to take responsibility.
So Ernie, I saw in the news this week, this discussion about the pervasive issues with the Navy's water system, which is not part of the BWS system. I want to be really clear. And now there's a new emergency connection bringing civilian water to that military system. And so what happened with that, and where are we with that situation?
So the Navy, last week, Friday, I get these cell phone calls that the Navy's asking for their old emergency connections with the Navy's water system. Some of them date back to the 1940s to open up at least 2 of them because they had a 36-inch transmission main break right by the Waiāhole power plant along the bike path. And that was the main pipeline carrying water across their system from the west to the east. They have other smaller pipelines, but they had problems with some of those pipelines. So they were struggling to keep up with the water demand for the entire base. So all the water is coming out of Pearl City area at Waiāhole Shaft, being pumped eastward across their whole base water system. So they asked us to open it up, and we worked through the weekend. It took to about Monday to get one of the connections opened up at near the Radford Terrace area, near Pu'uloa Road on the eastern end of their system. But it is a struggle, and I think they're waking up to the reality too. Like the Board of Water Supply, we did the Water Master Plan. We looked at our entire water system, and board adopted it. You were part of that effort, Kapua, back in 2016, but we laid out a plan over the next 30 years of how we need to continue to invest in replacing old pipelines, fixing up pump stations, developing new wells in the system, a whole variety of efforts. The Navy needs to, and I hope they have a plan for their Joint Base Pearl Harbor water system, but it sounds like their infrastructure is not in good shape too, and they need to proceed quickly to invest not only in their drinking water source, maybe a treating Red Hill Shaft or developing new wells, but they also have to look at all the pipes and tanks in their system too, because a failure in the infrastructure could lead to what they experienced over the last week.
Yes, thank you for that, Ernie. There's so much more that I feel like we can and should talk about with respect to Red Hill, but given the time, where can folks go for more information on this issue and to make sure they're up to date and can get plugged in to the degree that people want to help?
Well, I appreciate it. There are a number of community groups that have stood up, the Sierra Club, the Oahu Water Protectors. But for Board of Water Supply, please go to boardofwatersupply.com or protectoahuwater.org for more information. But also please visit the Navy's website, the Department of Health's website, and the EPA's website for information too. And Kapua, if I could say one last thing.
Please.
Vai is a gift to our community. It is a fragile gift that is easily contaminated and spoiled. We need to take actions to protect this precious Vai, this resource. its future is uncertain with climate change. So whatever we have right now, we need to protect and keep pure. There is no substitute for pure water.
Mahalo piha for all that you do, Ernie, to ensure that we have both vai and vai today and into the future. I'm deeply grateful, and I know that so many others are too. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I want to mahalo all of our guests for joining us today for this very important conversation. I'd also like to thank all of our sponsors for this event, the Hawaii Community Foundation, the UH Better Tomorrow Speaker Series, and its partners, the Hawaii Community Foundation and Kamehameha Schools. Other sponsors of the series include the William S. Richardson School of Law, the College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources, the College of Social Sciences, the Ulupono Initiatives, and the State Climate Commission. Please stay tuned for future conversations by going to the Better Tomorrow Speaker Series websites, or if easier, to subscribe to our feeds on Facebook, Insta, or Twitter to get updates. Mahalo again to all of you for joining us today. Ahui ho.